Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. This is your Friday rundown for August 22nd. A little bit more on that in a minute, but we are going to start with some headlines, just some quick hits. You can find more on basically all of this at IndyStar.com/sports, or if you want to be even more specific, IndyStar.com/sports/Hoosiers. The Hoops exhibition schedule set. Indiana will face Marion on October. I'm going to look this up while we're talking here. Indiana will face Marion on October 17th. That is the Friday of homecoming weekend. Indiana will play that game at Assembly Hall. It's important to note that because on the 26th, which is the Sunday after the UCLA game, so basically about 9-10 days later, Indiana will play Baylor in Indianapolis at Gainbridge Fieldhouse. Similar, obviously, structure to Indiana's game against Tennessee last year. You are going to see, I think, just a lot more of this, this balance of maybe one more traditional exhibition game against a lower division team at home, because you put that in your season ticket package. It's a chance to get in front of your season ticket holders in a meaningful way in the preseason, but then a chance to play a no-risk game against another Power 4 opponent, high major opponent, where you both get a really honest look at what you have to work on. Of course, listen, it's not a guarantee of anything. Indiana beat Tennessee at Tennessee last year, and it wound up not very much sort of predicting what was going to happen in Indiana's season. But it's important to note those tickets will go on sale, I believe, Saturday morning. I don't know a tip time for that yet. My suspicion is it'll be early because the Colts play a 4:30 home game that day. So I'm guessing noon, 12:30, somewhere there where they can get the traffic from that game in and out at least before kickoff. Of course, there will be traffic all day in Indianapolis, but still, you're not going to want those two events overlapping if you can avoid it. So my suspicion would be it'll be earlier in the day. But up in Indianapolis, Gainbridge Fieldhouse, Baylor, Indiana, October 26th. I'm going to take a drink of coffee here. Cafe Verona coffee, very good. The second question, the natural sort of follow-up question to those two exhibitions, and another headline that we haven't necessarily written about this week, but I think a lot of people have been curious about, I know I've gotten a lot of questions about it, is what does this mean for Hooser Hysteria? And the answer is it's not really clear at this point. Normally, Hooser Hysteria comes before either exhibition. In the last few years, Indiana has put Hooser Hysteria on that homecoming Friday, wanting to capitalize on the idea of lots of fans in town, lots of sort of the collegial atmosphere, bringing basketball into homecoming weekend and giving it kind of a place in the firmament of homecoming weekend. Now Indiana's playing a full-on exhibition there. I know I've written about this in the past. We've talked about this in the past. Some schools are moving away from the sort of midnight madness type event for a variety of different reasons. I'm not sure if Indiana's there yet or not. I could see the value in holding one this year, and there's every chance there will be one earlier in October. But it is, I think, more than one eagle-eyed fan spotted the fact that normally Indiana would be hosting Hooser Hysteria on Friday the 17th of October, and then would be playing those two exhibition games closer together and closer to the start of the season, which begins this year on Wednesday, November 5th. So if you want to think about this from a timing perspective, Marion exhibition is Friday the 17th. 9 days later, they play Baylor, and then 10 days after that, or 10, 11 days after that, they open the season. The old calendar would have been Hooser Hysteria, more where the Marion game is, and then two exhibitions closer to the start of the season. We'll keep our eyes peeled, keep our ears to the ground on whether or not Hooser Hysteria is still in the cards. I could certainly see the value in it in a year like this, when Indiana's getting to know a brand new head coach, a brand new staff, a completely new roster, at least from a scholarship perspective. But it's not clear yet, is the answer to that question. Kurt Cignetti spoke Friday at a press conference announcing Merchants Bank Field at Memorial Stadium. We'll talk more about that in a minute. That's going to be the big hit here. And one of his big messages was the Old Dominion game is not sold out. He wants it sold out. I think none of the three non-conference games at this point are sellouts. The Illinois game is, and Indiana does expect further sellouts in Big Ten play in terms of where ticket sales are tracking, how many are remaining, and what Indiana can expect as the season goes along. But Cignetti was emphatic. He brought a list of Power Four teams that had lost to Sun Belt teams in the recent past. Of course, he himself was a Sun Belt coach who had, I think, one Power Four victory, maybe a couple. But I know in his last year at JMU, they beat Virginia at Virginia. So he is keenly aware of what the Sun Belt can do, Sun Beast, if you are of a certain college football Twitter persuasion. And he wants a full house at Memorial Stadium for that game. A lot of Darren DeVries in the community this week. I believe he spoke at one or two events this week. He and his staff and a couple players got out and helped IU students move into their dorms. I'm going to write something on this over the weekend, but this is an interesting theme for DeVries, who really, couldn't really do a too much community stuff or forward-facing stuff back in the spring because the portal and just how that calendar moves so quickly now. And then, you're not going to do as much of that in the summer because, quite frankly, there's not as much of a community in Bloomington and certainly on campus in the summer. But I'll write something over the weekend on that. I just think it's interesting that it seems like there's a real intent on DeVries' part to get more involved there. Cignetti also said Friday Indiana is into Old Dominion prep. The Hoosiers held their last preseason scrimmage on Tuesday of this week, so whatever that would have been, Tuesday the 18th, Tuesday the 19th. My understanding was that was when they could get Big Ten officials in for the scrimmage, so they had to hold it that day. But basically, that last scrimmage is always, whenever it falls, more or less the end of your preseason, your proper preseason, and you move forward. And Cignetti suggested Friday that his team had started Old Dominion prep on Thursday, and obviously they will be in the 7-day game week routine here in the next, once they get to Sunday. So that begins in earnest now for Indiana. And the Hoosiers do so, we should say. USA Today, I was a voter in this poll. USA Today put together an All-American team, and 2 Hoosiers landed in the second team, All-American preseason USA Today honor. That's Aiden Fisher and D'Angelo Pons. I think Mikhail Kamara could have had an argument for that as well. I think I voted for Kamara and Pons and not Fisher, but you just continue to see a lot of different Indiana players picking up preseason honors, All-America, All-Big Ten, etc. One last thing in terms of headlines, because this continues to make headlines on scheduling, and I think we'll probably write more about this next week. We got a chance to talk to Scott Dolson on Friday, and we talked about a range of topics. Scheduling was one of them. Indiana's non-conference schedule continues to be a bone of contention, particularly among our friends down south. Of course, the SEC this week formally moved to 9 conference games plus a requirement to play a 10th conference or a 10th game against a Power 4 opponent in the non-conference. That's been treated, I think, in the public domain as one-upping the Big Ten a little bit, saying we're going to go to 9, and then we're also going to have this requirement that you used to have that you've kind of let lapse. I think it's also worth remembering there are several teams in the SEC that have historic out-of-conference rivalries that they are going to want to sustain. Georgia, Georgia Tech, Florida, Florida State, Clemson, South Carolina. I think Kentucky, Louisville. I think that's the 4. But I think this is also as much saying the SEC looking around and saying we're going to go to 9 conference games for everybody. If 25% of the conference is going to have a 10th power conference opponent every year just in the non-conference, if these 4 teams have to do it, everybody has to do it. Now, I suspect this is going to speed the march toward something more like Tony Petitti's 4-4-2-2 16-team playoff proposal, where the big conferences are going to get enough automatic qualifier bids, enough AQs that they don't feel like they will be overly penalized for losing non-conference games, essentially. And the philosophy behind all this and behind Petitti's push for the 4-4-2-2 model, which I think has a lot of fair criticisms, but the philosophy behind it is basically just to say that access to the playoffs should be determined through conference play. And the conference should put forward the teams that perform best in conference play. And that's when Petitti talked about needing incentives to play more difficult non-conference schedules. He was saying that the problem is that the risk isn't worth the reward for our teams if they're losing those games, and that's costing them on Selection Sunday when the playoff field is announced. So if we get to a place where the Big Ten, the SEC have, a greater number of automatic qualifiers, and I think the SEC going to 9 games is probably going to help with that. I think that's when you maybe see the Big Ten go back into a mode of, hey, we need all of you to challenge yourselves. We need all of you to kind of push yourselves a little bit in the non-conference as well. And it's worth saying, Indiana's added games through 2029, full schedules through 2029. As we've learned with the Virginia series, with the UConn series, with the Louisville series, those things can change. Those things can change. Those are not chiseled in stone. So I'll write more on that next week, but just as an idea, or just to kind of plant a seed. The biggest story of the week, I think it's probably fair to say from an Indiana perspective, is Merchants Bank of Indiana, which is headquartered up in Carmel. Strong ties to Indiana. Mike Petrie, who is president of Merchants Bank, has sat on IU's varsity club board for years. The varsity club is the fundraising arm of the athletics department. Merchants Bank is committing $50 million over the next 20 years to Indiana for the right to name the Memorial Stadium field Merchants Bank Field at Memorial Stadium. That is effective immediately. You will see that painted physically on the field on Saturday, next Saturday, when Indiana plays Old Dominion. It's going to be there for the next 20 years. Some background on that. This was a rule change last year. The NCAA, recognizing that schools needed more revenue streams to offset the revenue sharing and ballooning NIL asks and things like that, changed its rules around allowing on-field corporate naming. So you used to be allowed to sell the name to your field if you wanted to. And in fact, Scott Dolson said today that Indiana started courting Merchants Bank, I think almost 2 years ago, for this. But you could not physically advertise that corporate name on the field per NCAA rules. Washington has played for several years now on Alaska Airlines Field at Husky Stadium. They just couldn't write that on the field in a place where if you're watching the game on television, it is essentially, in-game advertising because it's painted right there on the field that you're watching. The NCAA changed that rule last year, and a number of schools have moved in recently to this space. I think a lot reserved kind of they stayed away from doing it last year because the rule only changed in June of 2024. I think everyone was trying to figure out what the market was going to look like, what was a reasonable ask, what was a reasonable sort of length of time for these partnerships. But Penn State, back in either the winter or the spring, announced a 15-year, $50 million corporate field naming sponsorship. Auburn announced one earlier this week. I'm not sure the terms were available. That was with Yellowwood, who's, if I'm not mistaken, Yellowwood's founder is an Auburn alum, a pretty prominent one. So, you are going to see more stuff like this. It's not dissimilar, for example, to, we've all had to kind of get used to baseball teams putting an advertisement on the sleeve of their jerseys in the last few years. It's the same idea, and in college athletics in particular, it is pointed directly toward trying to open up new revenue streams for college athletics departments at a time when they are having to fill the revenue sharing bucket. They're having to push more and more of their booster dollars over to their NIL collectives. So much is sort of the financial demands are changing for college athletics. The money is not flowing quite as freely. It is a little bit more in the Big Ten, maybe than the ACC, but in general, the money's not flowing quite as freely out of the media rights coffers as it was 10 years ago. And so it's just trying to create opportunities for athletics departments to try and sort of address some of those gaps and those shortfalls that are emerging. And for Indiana, it's not clear the exact terms of the payments here. Like, will Indiana get $2.5 million every year, or is it going to come in installments? It's not really clear. But water, money is like water. You pour it into an athletics department and it will spread out over everything. And, we asked Scott Dolson today being Friday the 22nd at the press conference, sort of formally announcing this, if he'd earmarked this money for anything, because, there's no inside information coming from me behind this, but one of the first things I thought when I saw those terms, $50 million over 20 years, or at least on average annual value, $2.5 million a year, I thought that is a comfortable start toward long-term financially planning for debt service on a major capital project. Indiana is in the process of developing a sweeping renovation plan for Memorial Stadium. There's a ton of infrastructural work that needs done. They're going to tear apart the press box, the suiting areas, and replace them. And we're talking about something that's going to cost millions and millions of dollars, probably 8 figures at least. Obviously, when you do stuff like that, you don't pay for it all up front. You finance it the way you finance a home, or anything like that. And one of the first things I thought was 20 million or 50 million over 20 years is a comfortable head start toward figuring out how, the financial planning element of how you are going to manage that debt service for a project like that. But Dolson said, he had a meeting with Curt Cignetti about basically where the money should go to. And he came away with 3 priorities. One was players, which I took to mean essentially revenue for players, revenue sharing and supporting player compensation, because that's so much the order of the day now. 2 was staff retention, which of course has been so important for Indiana. You think about the number of assistants they were able to bring back, the number of strength coaches they were able to bring back. They brought back essentially the entire recruiting and personnel room. So it's not just assistants, it's everyone in the operation. They were able to stay quite steady through last season to this one. Well, this aids that as well. And then the third area that Dolson talked about was facilities. And so I think it was his way of kind of saying, Memorial Stadium is still on the list. And there have been little bits and pieces. Indiana did some $1 million renovation or restorative work to Mellencamp Pavilion, which is the indoor practice facility this summer. They recently sort of sectioned off and renovated an area of the weight room that's specific to the football program. But those bigger projects, I think this helps Dolson start to build a financial plan for how to make something like Memorial Stadium renovation work. And, it's these revenue streams are open because of revenue sharing, but it's not just necessarily to go take that money and share it with the athletes. It's to say, there's this big bucket of money in your expense line annually now that you've got to fill that wasn't there last year. How can we create more opportunities for revenue growth that, again, maybe spreads out over the whole department, but causes, all the holes to fill up just a little bit more. And so it's an important thing, a genuinely important thing for Indiana. Last thing here, and then I'll let you go. And I don't think most of these videos will be this long. If you have not noticed, we have rebranded the YouTube channel. It is now IndyStar TV Hoosiers. We've brought it even more sort of fully under the umbrella of all of our coverage with the Star, with Gannett. Not a lot is going to change in terms of content. Of course, I'm still going to be around. Mike's still going to be around. We're going to start bringing you not just videos like this and podcasts and things, but also vertical videos, shorts, just quick hits on news and trending items and things like that. Look for that after, for example, a Curt Cignetti Monday press conference or a Darren DeVries pregame press conference, something like that. And we are going to try and build out a little bit more content like this, regular content. We are going to have a Friday rundown every Friday, at least through football season, and we'll see kind of where we get up to in terms of the format and everything from there. But stuff you can expect on a weekly basis. So Friday rundown will give you some headlines, talk about a couple of the biggest stories of the week, certainly give you a bit of a lead into the football game upcoming, and just sort of help you kind of reset from the week in all the coverage of all of what we've written about, and then look forward to, of course, the weekend. So you can expect these every Friday, provided travel doesn't get in the way or anything like that. We'll try to move them around if we need to in those rare instances. But that is all part of kind of a wider expansion of what we're trying to do with the YouTube channel. And so please, as always, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It makes it, it's been wonderful to see the growth of the channel over the last, several weeks. I know so many of you followed along with us when we were in Puerto Rico with the basketball team. And the more like, subscribe, recommend to your friends, word of mouth, that we can get, the more we can continue to grow the page. So we really appreciate everyone who's watching, who's engaging, and we hope to bring more to you here throughout football season and moving forward, in addition to everything that we are already doing over at IndyStar.com/sports, where obviously you can go as a one-stop shop for all of your IU sports news and information. So we'll leave it there. This has gone a little bit long today. Like I said, ideally these won't be quite as long in the future, but I wanted to kind of give you an idea of a little bit of the changes, if you've noticed them, what's going on, and what you can expect going forward, because we are going to keep building this thing out. So for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.